oublié le jour et l'heure et le temps qu'il fera demain. Je viendrai vous parler d'un monde qui disparut en un instant. Les siècles qui passaient comme les secondes, oh, comme on enfile un diamant. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi un peu d'eau froide, juste un peu d'eau froide, un peu d'eau froide. Donnez-moi un peu d'eau froide plutôt qu'une baignoire remplie de lait, pour me délasser des effets d'un voyage encapsulé. Pas besoin de luxe inutile pour apprécier la vue d'ici. Si vous saviez le ridicule d'un empire dans l'incendie. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Ces contrées stériles, je les laisserai, se demandant qui était cette fille qui ne fit que passer. Ils se lasseront de même, ou bien la terre les avalera. Ils récolteront ce qu'ils sèment. Moi et mon eau froide ne seront plus là. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi. Donnez-moi, donnez-moi un peu d'eau froide, juste un peu d'eau froide. Un peu d'eau froide, yeah. Juste un peu d'eau froide. Juste un peu d'eau froide.
Welcome back, welcome back. I can't believe how fast time flies when you're having fun. So welcome to our last plenary session. Hopefully you've been having loads of conversations today. Hopefully you've been meeting loads of people. And hopefully you're leaving today, or you're starting to kind of think about today about like all the questions and all the insights are coming up for you. But we also know that a lot of the times, we don't have enough time for sense making. We don't have enough time to digest what we've just heard. Like all the presentations I know had so much richness to them, so many insights, so many studies, so much evidence that was presented, new methods. So we've really started taking stock of what do we mean by the cutting edge when we talk about resilience evidence. So what we're going to do now is just take a deep breath and just try and figure out what does this all mean and start to do a bit of sense making. So, and also maybe just to kind of capture your attention as well in terms of what comes after this, we've got a roaring party set up straight after. So you bear with us for the sense making, and we've got an amazing welcome reception with a wonderful, wonderful set of performers. So there is a reward at the end of this, I promise. So now, just inviting you, and there's post-it notes on your table, there's also notepads, just to take a moment and just reflect individually, what is the one insight that you're taking away from today? What one thing struck you today? And we'll give you a few minutes. And if you already have your insight, you might need another moment, but if you already have your insight, please turn to someone you're sitting next to and share that insight. What is the one takeaway from today's conversations? But we can also be quiet for a bit longer.
Public service announcement about comic that we picked up from Nabil's table in the communities track.
La calle que está prendida mientras duerme sin poder soñar. Día tras día, despierta, ella sigue su vía. Always the same, that's not my way. Pa'lante sin saber qué haces. Día tras día, despierto, te darán por vencida. Always the same, that's not my way. Pa'lante, ya sabes qué haces. Mira cómo fluye, sigue el ritmo del tiempo. Acércate a la gente, grita tu mejor canción. En la calle, somos parte de ese grito escandaloso, somos mágicos. Olele, olá, olele, olela, olele, olela. Olele, olá, olele, olela, olele, olela. Si le pides que te espere no vas a poder. Hay cosas grandes, cosas que no podrás detener. Hoy sonríe sin pensar, ya no puedes ignorar. La calle que está prendida sigue ritmo, baila sin cesar.
So you guys are already doing this, but the next step is discuss with your whole table. So from your pairs, share those insights from that conversation, whole table discussion.
Quítame la mano, ¿de dónde la tienes? Ya te dije, nene, que eso no es así. Quítame la mano, ¿de dónde la tienes? Ya te dije, nene, que eso no es así. Una mami rica, bella, tropical. Una noche se fue sola para randear. Deja, niño, échate pa' allá. ¿Quién te dijo que tú puedes agarrar? Quítame la mano, mira, ¿de dónde la tienes tú? Quítame la mano, niño, que eso no es así. Quítame la mano, mira, ¿de dónde la tienes tú? Quítamela ya, no lo digo más. Chucu, chucu, chucu. Quítame la mano, ¿de dónde la tienes? Ya te dije, nene, que eso no es así. Quítame la mano, ¿de dónde la tienes? Ya te dije, nene, que eso no es así. Si ella quiere con un nene ya se va, pero a veces sola quiere parrandear. Si ella dice nada que nada, toca y te arrepentirás. Quítame la mano, ¿de dónde la tienes? Que eso ahí no viene bien. Ponle más abajo, vete pa'l carajo con tu mano también. Si te va a ganar, sabe cómo hacer. Mire que no hay nada que temer. Y si no sabe, pues llame a su madre pa' ver si le enseña cómo es que es. Mira cómo mueve la cadera. Todas las mujeres de Colombia y Venezuela, la dominicana, la puertorriqueña. Ay, cómo se mueve esa garota brasilera. Mira cómo mueve la cadera. Todas las mujeres de Colombia y Venezuela, la dominicana, la puertorriqueña. Ay, cómo se mueve esa garota brasilera. Si ella dice nada que nada, toca y te arrepentirás.
And now, hopefully, you're starting to see like what might be the theme that's emerging at this table. Are we all a bit confused about X? Or are we all getting really excited about Z? Keep the table conversations going, but we also want to see one submission per table via Mentimeter. So we'll just need one of you from each table to submit one theme that is coming from your conversation via this Menti code. So keep the conversations going, decide on a theme, and submit it via this code. And meanwhile, may I have our keynote listeners joining me on the stage?
Depuis longtemps nous aimons nous, mais l'esprit a malmené. C'est pour ça aujourd'hui nous ne pouvons pas retrouver nous. C'est comme ça la vie là est, toujours pour exister. Si t'es à la Guadeloupe, c'est là nous trouver l'amour. Mettez-vous bien, mettez-vous bien, mettez-vous bien, c'est là nous trouver l'amour. Mettez-vous bien. c'est là nous trouver l'amour. Mettez-vous bien. C'est là nous trouver l'amour.
Okay, thank you all. Really interesting to see the results that are coming in. So I think we've got about 11 tables who have fed back. Oh, maybe it's time for that trick again. Let's see, how tired are we? Getting there. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for this, for submitting these answers. I think it's really interesting. I was having a look, and what seems to come through is this theme of, may we have silence, please? Thank you. So what seems to come through is this theme around widening the perspectives. And what we wanted to do, so we've invited here one of the track co-leads from each of the tracks from this afternoon's conversations. And we're going to hear a report back of what some of these conversations that have been contributing to widening these perspectives around resilience, around measurement, around evidence. So we will be diving deeper into what were the key themes and the key insights that have been coming from these tracks. I will leave it to the track co-leads to introduce themselves, and then we'll hear back perhaps 3 to 4 minutes report back. And hopefully giving everyone who's not been in your parallel session a flavor of the richness of the discussions that took place. Shall we start with Dubale? Do you want to introduce yourself and give us a report back?
Thank you very much. I'm Dubala Admasu from USAID Ethiopia. I'm the resilience advisor for the mission activities. So I will be representing the people household track. And we focused on 2 areas, financial inclusion and social protection. So on the first side, where the first session, we explored, the latest evidence on critical roles of financial inclusion and transformation as a source of resilience for households across context, as well as, the role of formal and informal institutions. To maybe, share few observations from several presentations. Almost we had 8 presentations summarizing and taking, the key takeaway as part of, the participant. It is very challenging task we are given, but I will share, very few key takeaways from those this presentation, as well as question and answer from the participants. One thing is, in terms of being affected by different shocks, it is the informal sector, particularly on the finance side, is highly affected, and also is not getting the social protection. And for that one, in one of the presentations, it was said it will be good because they are not addressed by the formal sector, how we can get, the cost-effective saving schemes for the informal sector, so that, they can also get access to finance. In the case of presented from Rwanda, the EJO has a scheme was a very good exemplary. But what is also came from that presentation is the political commitment, as well as the engagement of the private sector, is very critical in terms of building trust, keeping the model as well very simple, and also having proper communication. And the other one, in terms of still improving access to finance, is the case study presented from Kenya was very critical, where for the informal sector particularly, working on the supply side as well as the demand side, in terms of the demand side, providing technical support through technologies, social inclusion, and like Sharia compliant products provision. And from the supply side as well, as availing semi-commercial funds like the USAID revolving fund provided, which were able to leverage huge amount of financial resource for the informal sector, as well as building on the Gramini model, where groups, although they are not addressed, assisted from the formal sector, how they can build their own collateral so that they can access, which showed huge access to finance. The other one, very interesting, was how we can improve insurance financial access to the unreached communities, particularly women-headed household, and even within the households, also for women and youth. In that case, having a family unit insurance rather than asset-based insurance came very critical and exemplary, where women in those rural settings, they don't have access to land, ownership to land, and big assets to livestock. So having that family unit insurance was very interesting, and that can also improve access to finance. The other one was blending different technologies, and that was the case presented from CIMIT, which was very interesting, how the drought-tolerant maize was merged, blended with the index-based insurance that unlocks the potential of improving access for these services from the households. And then those households were not participating in the blended services, both drought-tolerant crop as well as the insurance scheme, bounced back 43% of their initial food security level, while those blended households that participated in the blended service were able to have 82% increase from the original, which I've been discussing in the morning, how resilience, not bouncing back, but even to the better food security. And then these blended technologies, finance, as well as insurance scheme, was very critical. Maybe just going to the second part of the social protection, we learned social protection is not only social building social assistance, but as well here as well, social insurance was also very critical. Shock responsive social protection, and the case of COVID was very exemplary. And although it was not predictable as it was supposed to be, but countries were able to renew their commitments and continue. That helped to have better social insurance. And the case of the case presented from Malawi as well was having a regulatory as well as predictable insurance and payouts, and also cash transfer was very important. And not only that one, but having comprehensive programming, complementary livelihood, cash assistance, plus livelihood diversification options were very important in terms of building resilience capacities all at the 3 level, and anticipatory actions and program level financing, risk financing were also mentioned in that. And the interesting thing is where the government, local governments take the lead and champions those changes, as the case of Malawi, was very critical in terms of reaching scale. And one ministry mandated to lead those coordination for resilience building and cash transfer. And the other one is also avoiding duplication, where they built a system for digital payments and social registry, having a common agenda for the government as well as development partners was also very useful. Let me know when I'm left with 1 minute.
Oh,
Am I gone?
10 seconds.
Woo! Yeah, I think a lot, to take as a resilience person, a lot of, maybe let me jump to the final one if that is the case. And the other one was on the risk buying, where advising with appropriate technical support for the government, where they can buy the risk and which one they can retain, which can they share, as well as which risks can they transfer in terms of, and then with associated contingency planning, risk transfer parameters, modeling drought response, and also engaging the wider community was very important in terms of not only response, but as well building resilience capacities. A lot
Thank
to
you,
take,
Dubale.
but I struggle to summarize.
I think that will be true for all of the tracks. I don't envy any of our keynote listeners. They're performing an amazing role tonight. And I really want to just cherish and celebrate this role, because a lot of the times we have keynote speakers, but actually we have keynote listeners. So these amazing individuals have been quietly listening in to all the sessions and are here to give us the key insights and themes. Shall we go to the second track? I'm going to keep in the order of the scales that we have that also works with the sources of resilience framework. So if I can go to you, Charles, what came out in the communities track?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the team and presenters under the community track. Most of the cases which were shared were focusing on the indigenous knowledge, and especially linkage with the scientific knowledge. Something which emerged is the tension between the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge. Of course, there was one of the key players who raised the question, why is it that when the indigenous knowledge is attempted to be linked to the scientific knowledge, there is the value of the indigenous knowledge? So there's need to valorize the indigenous knowledge. Secondly is, how do we co-create especially common data bases or common data platforms for the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge? Because it's emerging that like scientific data or meteorological data, they are operating in silo, while the indigenous knowledge, which has been shared by communities over thousands of years, is not getting that space in the linkage space. So the investments that needs to be done is to have that common platform and really add value to that. The second, the second point is on transitioning this indigenous knowledge to the policy space. What was not discussed at length is the linkage, especially with the policymakers at the national level. There was a lot of investment, which was actually the target of the track, is to provide the cases around bottom-up knowledge generation and usage. But the question around, again, the high-level policy space, whereby they've got decisions, even if there is a devolved government systems like for Kenya, the national government still plays a significant role in decision making. If you look at the climate finance, the Ministry of Treasury still make that decision. So the next phase that needs to be focused on is, how do we also transition this hybrid indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge to that high-level policy space, like to inform discussions around global stocktake among the heads of states in Africa or the African group of negotiators, because the submissions are made by the national governments. And then the fourth point is there were discussions around experiences around application of methods and approaches. And what I like, we had from India, the citizen science, and then of course we had the arts and games. And I like one of the youth from South Africa, I don't know if you can stand up, introduced the indigenous games. The community track, the team who are presenting on there was a youth representative from, I think he's from South Africa. I don't know who has ever heard of indigenous games. And he really brought out very strongly among the Khoi community that indigenous games now is kind of catalyzing the interaction of the young people and the children to really create that level playing ground and also interactive space so that they can really bring out the knowledge they have as young people, but also interact with the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge. So that is one of the key lessons that I picked from the indigenous games, which I picked as a lesson. But of course, the discussion again around the investments. Where are the platforms, common platforms for all these, especially from Sub-Saharan Africa? Where do we converge in the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge? And I was sharing with our group, for instance, we were from Bonn, and the question was, African governments or governments are submitting their positions with regard to global stocktake. But the question I was asking each of the participants, which we were on the table, who has ever interacted with a reporting framework from subnational government or national government in your country? Can you raise your hand? Who has ever seen a reporting framework for adaptation? One. And I will share with you a very concrete case, right? For instance, Kenya. I asked the director for climate change in Kenya and the subnational government, the directors who are representing the climate change community in their governments. And the question they raise is, the frameworks which are being shared is treating like Sub-Saharan Africa or even a subnational government as it is so homogeneous. But when you go inside, you find the wetland, you find the arid, semi-arid, islands. I come from islands. If you plant 1 hectare of maize per unit, you might get 30 sacks. But if you plant in semi-arids, there are more needs, like more water, and then again, you might get low yield. How do you use that as an adaptation metric to measure the resilience also as an outcome? And that one raises the question that one of the colleagues here raised, we need to redefine resilience, but also from my side, also another which I've had, is redefining metrics. Are we focusing on metrics for input, for output, for outcome and impact? So we are still even not focusing on the impact. So how do we invest in resilience that will create impact by really building resilience of the people? And I'll recommend you to read the paper, the adaptation metric report by the Global Commission on Adaptation, because I realized there is also skill gap or knowledge gap around which metrics are we focusing on, even though the definition of adaptation and resilience is still a question and is a context specific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you to all our keynote listeners. Kara, shall we go to the urban systems track?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. Charles, how can I possibly follow up after you? I'll do my best. So I'm representing the urban track, and as a reminder, our focus is on informality, climate adaptation, and also conflict, rights, and displacement. Cities are complex risk environments, and to engage in urban resilience programming, projects, or processes, you really must have a systemic understanding of how risks affect urban areas. We talked about how it's important to understand and address a multi-hazard environment, look at the interconnected nature of challenges facing cities, including the complex cascading risks that they're facing, and also think about things like risk transfer, in these densely populated areas. And so a couple examples that came out around thinking about these interconnected issues. One is, if you're working on land tenure and affordable housing, you need to also be thinking about water access. I mean, they're intrinsically linked. Addressing conflict should be done alongside are looking at hydromet hazards. And also crime. I mean, crime is something that completely undermines our ability to deal with risk. And so, you know, when you're engaging in urban resilience programming, it's not one sector and then another sector and another sector. You really need to be thinking across sectors and also looking at this complex risk environment. And urban resilience programming really lends itself to collaborative forms of urban governance. Someone said governance with communities, not for communities, which I think is a really good summation of thinking about how we think about working on resilience. And on the theme of, on that theme, there's also a theme around building the capacity of communities to collect data and meaningfully engage in solutions that affect them. We talked about building capacities and partnerships to build local solutions, and then localizing our understanding of risks, like climate risks. And an example was around community-led citizen science. Through something like citizen science, where local community members are able to present their lived experience of living with heat, for example, then they're able to share that directly with local officials or decision makers who are planning and implementing interventions that directly affect them. And so I think an emergent theme is really that data is power. A USAID colleague in Zimbabwe shared that there was an assumption in the mission that people living in urban areas were better off than those in rural areas. But then when they actually looked at the data, they found that 28% of people living in urban areas were food insecure compared to about 25% of people in rural areas. So they had an assumption, but then when they looked at the data, they were able to have a different impression of what the problem really was. Another example is around informal settlements, particularly with internally displaced persons. They're living in very fragile states with protracted crises, and we simply don't have enough data. So it's important to work to fill that data gap, but that shouldn't be a constraint or a barrier to engagement. So it's like we need to fill the data gap while also thinking how we can engage now. There were two specific climate-related hazards that came up as increasingly important. One was heat. Particularly affects people in low-income areas and informal settlements. It's a slow onset risk, so it's often underemphasized. But the heat intensity in particular affects people in informal settlements at a much greater scale. And we need not only to address heat, but also come up with the metrics to measure it. Another example of a slow onset, high intensity climate impact is urban flooding. And so those were two kind of heat and flooding areas that are like maybe from our group's perspective really important and increasingly important, but not emphasized as much in urban resilience programming. And so a couple entry points we talked about: how can data be translated into action? I'm calling it data fatigue. There was this conversation around how people in informal settlements are always getting like knocks on their doors, people collecting data, and it's really important that we, or those who are engaging in research, can describe the value added of the research that they're going to be conducting, and how it will add value to the conversation, including how it can add value to data that's being collected at various scales, from the local all the way up to national and other scales. And that data collection can really be a transformative tool. And then the other thing I have to mention as an urban planner myself is that we did talk a little bit about urban planning and design as an entry point. The urban form really shapes things like heat intensity. Areas with less vegetation are hotter. They also correlate with lower incomes and non-white communities that will often have poor quality construction. So I think I'll stop there. And it was a really rich discussion, and I couldn't possibly summarize everything, but I implore you to join us tomorrow. You can learn more.
Thank you, Cara. Tasvia, shall we go over to you? And I know you also have a slide, so if we can move back to the slide with the visual harvest that you guys have created.
Thank you. I
Did you
hope
hear
I'm
that, Tasvia?
all thanks for Sonia there. She has done all this amazing work, so yeah. I'm Tasfia. I will be reporting back from the Social Ecological Systems track, which you're calling ACS track. And thanks to Albert, Nadia, all our presenters, and our graphic harvester for pulling out all of these amazing messages together. So I'll be very brief. So I think in the very beginning, Nadia has mentioned about that in the social ecological systems track, we'll be focusing on the interactions between people/community and nature/ecosystem. So as this is a bit of broad discussion, so I've started with the framing or understanding of these issues of resilience, where Nate has very clearly talked about the attribution of resilience. If I being very brief, those attribution, there are 5 attributions he mentioned about, which are diversity, redundancy, connectivity, inclusivity and equity, and adaptive learning. But having said that, there are trade-offs in understanding, and for example, what sort of connectivity is needed to keep the system resilience, and there comes the point for this capacity where we have where Nate has put a very good point of like capacity can be seen from persist, adapt, and transform lens. So in the persist means where we don't want systems to collapse, but there we now go for adaptation. So we want the system to help them adapt to with the change. But now the lens are going towards more on transformation, which is kind of a novel approach. And in this transformation, the key message that came out is the innovation is the real hope, where we can, for example, challenge the existing system and build and break the resilience concept. So from there, we had so it's the overall resilience framing, but then we had, because I told that it's on the people and then nature, so we had a conversation from Gina, who talked about adaptation governance from community perspective. So from her presentation, we had focused on this systems approach to responding through different shocks and changes. And as this resilience is a very complex to understand, we need to see this from systems point of view and allowing, which can give us more room for learning. Even if, because we talk about resilience, it's kind of a process. Even if we cannot become resilient, kind of we need to learn from safe to fail resilience approach. So this is one learning that came out in that discussion. And then finally, we had a presentation on nature-based solutions, where there are the final message that came out is that holistic social ecological systems framework is needed for NBS resilience, but there are gaps in evidence, or the evidence is kind of scattered. So more research, like consolidated research, is needed there. But having said all of this, the issues of time frame and scale are still of questions, and like long-term ecological health gain versus short-term. So like how to work on that. So we ended our notes on there, and then we moved forward to the how session. So in the how, we had 2 fantastic speakers who started, Nadine and Shiona. So they have talked about climate change adaptation framing, where they have focused on adaptive capacity, livelihood assets, and equity cycle. But they mentioned about not focusing only on the generic adaptive capacity, but also on the specific adaptive capacity when we think about solutions for communities and people. And thus transformation need to be more need to focus on more pragmatic approach to help people to change their mindset. I think that was being also discussed in the opening plenary when we talk about like people shifting their mindset. And then we had another presentation which focusing on the global south perspectives of framing vulnerability, but I think we need to, the message was that we need to pay close attention to what is making people vulnerable to climate change impacts so that we can consider the social dimension of NBS, and they should not just for equity, but for success, like how we can invest in nature-based solutions to have more impacts, more positive impacts and outcomes. And lastly, we have focused on this story, art, visual. So we have the colleague from Creative, Clara, who shared on the importance of creative-based participatory engagement and research, which can allow the community or youth to engage in the resilience process. Having said all of this, I'll just end with a note that I just attended right before I came in here, that when we are talking about all of this resilience approach, we are making this horizon a bit more like a widening. But I think we need to, because we are all from different tracks, there are many cross-cutting themes. So all the evidence or all the evidence are there in a sporadic manner or in a scattered manner. So need to bring all of these in a collective format. So that is kind of a challenge. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tassia. 1,000 points to those who can create the ultimate wayfinding navigation system for resilience evidence. But we're humans, so we're trying. Before we go to Gerald, could we go to the slide that has all the speakers? I know that some of you have been asking. Perfect, thank you. Over to you, Gerald.
Yeah, thanks, Corina. And I think we had quite a very interesting conversation at the market systems and value chains resilience. I mean, looking into that, I think the discussion kind of drifted from different angles. Keep in mind that we had the private sector in the room, but also we have donor and looking at the private sector. So there is a key issues that were mostly covered in that conversation. I'm going to touch on a few of them. The market systems and the players within the market, creating a strong resilience supply chains actually depends on how well functioning market system is. And we got quite a number of examples which were given out actually providing and some proving that strengthening the market system actually can actually enhance resilience on the market system. Particularly, we got an example from the guy from economic here, I think Michael, looking into how the market system, for instance, on the vanilla and the supply from Madagascar, how the smallholder farmers became resilient even in the last 3 years, where we've seen some difficult situations from the COVID one and also to the war in Ukraine. There was resilience among the supply chain from the smallholder farmers, but again, if you look on the international sort of logistic supply chains, it's kind of broke down. And this was informed by the investment, but also work that has done to the smallholder farmers, empowering them actually to be resilient, more resilient, and continue to produce even during those difficult moments. Another point was about the value addition, how enabling value addition on the market system through those players actually strengthen the market system. So looking into how much is being retained by the smallholder farmers supplying to the market system, looking into the issues like the middlemen, the examples how the supply chains go from the smallholder farmers, the first middleman, the second middleman, until the product reaches to the final destination. So cutting all that in terms of empowering smallholder farmers into their cooperatives for them to be able to actually adequately advocate for the value of what they produce has actually retained more value of actually what they produce and what they supply to the market onto themselves. Also, I think this was termed, and I did like that, it's an enduring supply chain play. We actually have heard this from this morning, enduring supply chains, and actually saying that we don't look this as a CSR anymore. This has to change. It has to be embedded into the business strategy, taking into account that the value of the smallholder farmers actually are integral part in the market system, and them being resilient is actually enabling the markets also to be resilient. We had also another point, I think this was the FAO, and we got a bit of a data which actually tells the importance of the resilient market system as the source of the resilience to the household and communities. So for the last 7 years, the number of people in need of humanitarian aid has actually more than doubled to 258 million people. And actually, this is mostly due to the not well-functioning marketing system that has actually created the trouble in terms of getting things to the right places. And also, most of the people in fragile countries are in rural areas. So this depends more on the well-functioning marketing system for them to remain resilient more. They also issued around the adaptive capacity, around the households, around the market players, and how that kind of, it's actually different between those different players in markets, and enhancing the adaptive capacity from both the smallholder farmers to other market players would enhance that. We also looked into the role of enabling environment at the market systems. This looked both from the political sides and the policy side and regulations, and how can that actually improve the well-functioning marketing system, which also is how can be the good source of the resilience to the local communities. We also looked into how resilience is actually different from different perspectives. I mean, people's stories of resilience are quite different, and looking into that perspective, treating the resilience from different communities, but also peoples, has to be looked into very different. We also looked into the role of the local private sector players, which mostly we found that are more resilient rather than the bigger private sector players, because, for instance, we looked into the agro dealers versus input suppliers, and how agro dealers are more resilient in the market system compared to input suppliers. First, because they are very close to their clients. I mean, they interact on a daily basis with smallholder farmers, know whether this seed supply is not working, or so forth. And the feedback mechanism between them and actually the people that they serve is quite very fast, compared to the hierarchy of the input suppliers and the other guys on top of that. Also, we had looked into the whether it is actually good to have integration between local markets and the international markets. And then, looking in the past 3 years, we've seen how the international markets have responded to some of the shocks that have happened, both natural, you look into COVID-19, but also the war in Ukraine. I mean, so having a strong local market systems would ensure that people that actually depend mostly on the local market systems continue to be resilient, while these international market systems perhaps suffer mostly from these shocks, and takes time perhaps to actually to respond and adapt and actually come back to provide more the needs in terms of services. So there was quite a number of discussion, and I hope tomorrow is going to be more fun day in terms of discussion on the market resilience. So you're all welcome to join our track and have more.
Thank you, Gerald. And before I let you go, and before we wrap this session up, I am curious whether there is one thing that surprised you, or one thing that you thought was missing from the conversations today. Putting you on the spot. Anything where you went, huh?
That's a reflection.
Anyone? Are we all just tired? It's the day one tiredness. Okay, well, we'll pick that up, and actually we start day 2 tomorrow with the fireside discussion with 5 other track co-leads that will be moderated by my colleague Suchi Vora. So hopefully with a night of digestion, we will start seeing like what are the themes that are coming up and also what might be the implications for the conversations tomorrow, critical conversations on the who. So what are the needs and the trade-offs of evidence users, evidence producers? Thank you for today. We have a really important housekeeping announcement. In the communities session, there was an original cartoon that went missing. If anyone picked it up by mistake, could they please return it to Suchi? Suchi will wave. Thank you. It was the artist's only copy. So if it is somewhere lost, please find Suchi and let's help us reunite them. Thank you for today. More tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp here. And now, please join us in Hall C for a wonderful, wonderful evening reception. I'm very excited for this. So thank you for everything, and thank you for today.